Why am I such a disaster? I can't remember our intro. How long has it been since we've done one? I'm Nicola, you're Liam. We're about lecturers in IDT. Okay. Welcome to In Bits, the podcast that deconstructs our digital lives. I'm Nicola.
And I'm Liam.
And we're about lecturers in the Institute of Art, Design and Technology in Dún Laoghaire.
So, Nick, what are you in bits about this week?
I am in bits about catfishing. So there's been a few kind of high-profile catfishing. There's been a few high-profile catfishing cases in the media recently, and I thought it would be really interesting to look at the psychology behind it. So why people engage in catfishing, and a little bit as well on the effects of catfishing on victims, but primarily looking at what it is that makes people engage in catfishing and what they get out of it.
Okay, we need a spoiler warning or a content warning.
We do. Because this involves deception. It often involves kind of sexual harassment or image-based sexual abuse. The people who have been catfished are often quite traumatized and quite upset by it. So if any of this affects you, then please see the show notes for our mental health resources. Or if you think this will be difficult for you, this might be one to skip.
Okay, yeah.
So would you like to tell me what you think of when you think of catfishing?
I think of someone pretending to be someone else online deliberately, probably because they're afraid to tell the person who they are, or they're engaged in that mystical fantasy and want to actively deceive someone.
So that's pretty much it. The understanding, if you ask a lot of people what catfishing is, it actually varies quite a lot. So a lot of people will talk about it like that it is someone who either steals somebody else's identity and pretends to be them. So there's a little bit of identity theft aspect to it sometimes, or creates a completely fake identity and uses that as their own. The whole purpose of it is to trick somebody else into developing an online relationship, right? So it's distinct from impersonation. Because that is just taking somebody else's ID. A big characteristic of catfish relationships is that lack of any in-person interaction. But people do have varying different ways that they think about catfishing. So a lot of people describe it as using highly filtered images over photoshopped images, lying about their weight, showing up on a date after having a particular online dating profile and not looking quite like who they are. So we had an example of that in the online dating episode where someone was like, they weren't quite as attractive as they appeared.
No, it was what they had presented online was not what was advertised. I'm not going to forget that language.
I was trying not to use that language. But that's not really it. That's sometimes described as kitten fishing, where you kind of maybe are deceptive about some aspects of who you are, but you're still fundamentally the same person, just with a wider amount of variation than would be socially acceptable. Catfishing, though, is that creating a very distinct identity, completely separate from your own. And oftentimes it's people creating multiple identities. So a whole suite of characters or like a universe that they have created for themselves to back up the main character identity as well. It's likely quite underreported because oftentimes people don't know they've been catfished, or because the catfish doesn't reveal their identity, or because they realize kind of early on that they're being catfished and they just kind of stop talking to them and it doesn't go any further.
There's so many different ways in which it can appear. Like, so you're talking about they may not actually know who or interact with that person in real life, if we use that kind of term, but they actually might be in the same space as that person who is catfishing them, and they may be completely unaware of it as well.
Yeah, there was a case that I heard a psychologist talking about where it was someone in their workplace had been catfishing them and also abusing them within that relationship, being quite like engaging in a lot of coercive control, but they didn't know it was the person that they worked with initially. So it's quite problematic because you don't know who the person is. I'm going to talk about a couple of cases where this is an interesting characteristic of it, because there are quite a few victims of catfishing. It's not always just the person who is being catfished, which I think is interesting about it and not very nice about it. So it can happen anywhere online. Like, it happens in online communities. in lots of different ways. It's a bit harder on social media than in online dating, but it does still happen in social media. In social media, you need other friends and other people to validate that persona. So if someone friended you on social media and they had no friends, that would be immediately suspicious. But if they have friends and those friends talk to them and comment on their pictures and like them and maybe start even interacting with you, that feels more real.
But there's probably layers to that catfish, because there's like let's call it catfish profile 1, and then they have like, let's compare it to like Bebo Top 16. There's a flashback. So the rest of their connections are also fake profiles that validate that fake profile.
Yeah. It's like the Marvel Cinematic Universe of catfishing characters.
Okay. I prefer my Bebo reference more.
Yeah. So it happens quite a lot in online dating because obviously you don't need that validation from other people. You can create any character you want there. That's why it's quite common there. But it happens, like I said, in lots of different spaces. So I want to talk about a couple of cases that have been in the news, particularly in Ireland and the UK. In Ireland, there is the GAA catfish case. And I will link to the podcasts on this in our show notes and also a news story on it if you don't have time to listen to 3 long podcasts about it, because this is quite the story. So it's played out over the last few years in Ireland. There's 2 podcasters called the Two Johnnies, and they were the ones that brought it to light. It involves a young Irish woman who has created multiple online accounts, so a whole web of characters that support her story. She's targeted a lot of young men, including GAA players, people in the entertainment industry, including one of the Two Johnnies. So even after their first 2 podcasts came out about this, she continued on with this behavior. And this is something that we'll see in a lot of these high-profile cases, that even when the person is caught out, they keep going. It's like they're unable to stop doing it. So more and more, since the last 3rd podcast episode came out on this, more and more people have come forward to say that they were targeted, and it appears there's more serious aspects to some of that targeting as well. So it's kind of unclear at the moment whether she's still subject of an investigation in Northern Ireland or in the Republic of Ireland, because she's apparently from the north, but it is possible that there is still an investigation going on.
But if she's been caught out, that's not necessarily that she's going to view that as necessarily a bad thing. It's you've catfished successfully all of these people, sense of self-efficacy in your catfishing skill. Yeah. I'm trying to understand the rationalization of continuing even though they've been outed.
Yeah, well, it's kind of interesting because it appeared that one of the purposes of her catfishing was she could create these female characters that were very attractive, that she would then target these young men and then introduce herself as their friend, as the girl's friend, so that she got to actually meet the people that she was targeting in real life.
But the friend doesn't show up.
But the friend doesn't exist, doesn't show up, etc. And so she's the one then chatting to them and making friends with them and stuff. So it seems to be a way to connect with these people in real life, but using other people's images to do that. And some of the people whose images were taken, so there was an Irish influencer whose image was stolen to be one of these characters. And she talked about, the kind of stress of not knowing how your image is being used and what things are being said to people and what kind of perhaps abuse is happening under your name and under your image. Well, not under your name because she's using a different name, but under your image. It's like quite difficult knowing that.
Yeah. I think like we joke about it like amongst my friends where like you see your friend posts on Instagram and their photographs are being used in an online dating profile or something, and they're like, oh, you could have made me a couple of years younger or something, and they joke about it from that perspective. But if someone is stealing your identity to interact with someone else, manipulate that other person, imagine one of these lads came up to that person and it's like, hey, you never showed up to that date, or I can't believe you said that to me. You're also putting their safety at risk.
Absolutely. And that leads really well into our next story, but also from other people that I've heard where that has happened, particularly people in the public eye, where someone has come up to them and said, why aren't you messaging me back? Or we were supposed to meet. And they're like, who are you?
Which I think is kind of fair enough.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
So the next story is one journalist Ellen Coyne wrote about this. And it's a woman called Evine. She's a producer and actor. And she wasn't catfished herself, But everything about her identity, her name, her images, her job description, her home address were all used by a catfish continuously over about a year. Usually a catfish will steal somebody's photographs, right? But they'll use a different name so that they're not caught doing it. And that's what makes this case a little bit different. When she heard about it first, she laughed it off as well, kind of like your friends. Like, this seems to happen a lot. She talked about her own friends laughing off the fact that somebody had used their images in online dating as well. This seems to be quite a regular occurrence. But this catfish was a bit different. It went a lot further. They didn't just use her images, they used her real identity. And then more and more victims kept finding her on Instagram and messaging her because they had used her real identity. First, they were just letting her know that someone was using her identity, right? They realized what had happened. But then some of the messages were much more distressed. So it was quite clear they were being treated very badly by this person. Because it was going on so much, she started reporting these profiles. They were on dating apps, Hinge and Tinder and so on. And they would get taken down, and then very quickly another one would go up and another one would go up. And as fast as she could get them down, there were 2 or 3 or 4 going up. And you need a phone number to put these up. So this person had obviously a whole bunch of different phone numbers. So at one point, a friend of hers matched with this person and realized what was going on. And they actually got involved in a conversation, and it got very sexual. And she was really uncomfortable that her image and her identity was being used in this way. And in a creepy, weird way. She also had a conversation with the person herself, trying to figure out who they were. And again, the conversation kept going back to that sexual stuff. And she found it really distressing, knowing that people would think it was her. For a start, she was in a relationship, so that people would see her on there and think it was her. Her friend kind of arranged to meet the catfish for a date to see where they might suggest. And it was in the cafe right beside her house. And this was during lockdown. This was basically the only place she went. So she felt like if she went in there, people might be waiting to meet her for a date when she went to get her coffee.
But was that catfisher trying to target her in that? You start to report those profiles and get those profiles taken down.
And
it's not a coincidence that they're using that cafe. And the first response I would have would be ring the guards.
They did, and it's not illegal. Nothing she had done at that point is illegal. And that is one of the problems we have. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a sec.
Okay.
But this kind of behaviour isn't actually illegal. We don't have a catfishing law in Ireland at the moment.
Imagine you're AVing this person, and your spouse, your partner sees that or hears from one of their friends, hey, your missus was matched with me on a dating app. Do you know that she's even on this? Never mind. So that's a test of trust. And even if you're fine in your relationship, you contact them and you say, hey, what's the crack? Is this you? And they're like, no, it's not. It's fine. There's still a little doubt still there.
Yeah.
And then they're continuing to interact in that way. And that catfish has clearly got personal details or sensitive details about that profile or about that person. And then they could potentially create a convincing enough profile that spouse.
Well, they talked about their occupation, where they were from, their background. They had a lot of information. Okay. And so this is why it's not just a pure catfishing case. There's a lot of overlap in this one with stalking. So they didn't appear to be directly stalking. It was indirectly stalking. And there is a huge overlap between stalking and catfishing. But they are also separate things. So catfishing can be a big part of stalking, but stalking doesn't have to be a part of catfishing.
But we also looked at in previous episodes, we talked about connectedness online, social support, and this starts to intrude on other connections that we have online, and your digital identity is a lot more than just physical identity or offline identities and the space that you're supposed to be in. It's very oppressive.
It really
in terms of how it's impacting their digital behavior.
There's a quote from her in in the news article, and said, I don't know what's going to happen when I leave the house, if I'm going to see them, and if I'll know who they are, and if they'll approach me, or if that's not their game, what else are they doing? Are they just watching me? How far is this person willing to go? That is extremely oppressive. She did try and report them to the police. The police couldn't do anything about it because it's not a crime. So she actually got a number connected to the person that she thought might be the catfish after doing quite a bit of investigation herself, and sent a very cautious text to them, and then found out that person had reported her to the police for harassment. And at that point, I think that was probably the lowest point or the most distressing point for her. She felt like there was no help available. It was completely out of control at that point.
So she was being reported for trying to stop the behaviour.
Exactly.
What did the guards do?
Nothing.
Because there's no
Because it's
legislation.
not legislated for us. They can't really do anything about it. There's a certain loss of control when your image is stolen that's really difficult, because we do try and manage our image of ourselves online. So it is very difficult when that happens. So that's one side. That's the person whose identity is stolen. Then there's a case in Scotland, ongoing case, to be honest, in Scotland, a woman, Adele Rennie. And this is a really complex case. It spans longer than 10 years now at this point. So Adele Rennie is a former NHS nurse, quite young woman. And she targeted women local to her over more than 10 years. From the outside, she appears not to be what you think of as a typical catfishing perpetrator. So she was a nurse. She was apparently very well liked in her offline life. But she created multiple characters and aliases and targeted potentially hundreds of victims.
Where were the victims from? Like,
They were
how did
all
she
from the
source
local
them?
area in Scotland.
So they're not like former patients or
No,
okay.
not that I'm aware of anyway.
Like, how sinister do these layers go?
Yeah,
Okay.
no. It's sinister enough without it being that. Yeah. Her first court trial was in 2017, and she was jailed for nearly 2 years after admitting to 18 offences against 10 women, dating back a number of years at that point. It was about 5 years at that point. Then just 2 years later, she was sent to prison for a second time after she targeted a further 3 victims that are known of. And she used things like voice-altering apps to change her speech so she could pretend to be a man. And she had a bunch of different aliases that she was using. And she did this despite being under strict notification requirements as a registered sex offender.
I have so many questions.
Yeah, I know.
So firstly, you said she's a registered sex offender. What is that related to what she was doing in her catfishing behavior?
Yes. So she manipulated and coerced victims into sending intimate photographs. And then she used them to blackmail them and threaten to expose them if they attempted to break off contact.
Lovely.
Yeah.
And in terms of the type of catfishing behavior, was it like she was impersonating females all the time, males? What happened?
So the main characters, her main aliases, seemed to be all male, but there were also female supporting characters. So she would get in touch with somebody as a man, and if they got suspicious or if the person broke off contact, she might get in touch with them as a friend of the man who was a woman and to say, oh, give him another chance, he's so great, you should really try going out with him again. So there were a lot of supporting characters.
Okay, so she's really dark triad.
We'll get into that.
Okay,
Don't skip ahead.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, cool.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
They're my questions for now.
And that's just so that was her first set of offences, right? Then 2 years later, she was sent back to prison for the second time, despite being a registered sex offender and not being allowed to contact any of her victims. When she was released from jail in January 2025, she was again subject to monitoring and restrictions. And just 10 days after being released, she sent a text message to one of her previous victims.
Why was she allowed access to tech?
I think they had gone through her phone to make sure that she didn't have victims' names in there, but she had the victim's name in as something else.
As an alias, okay.
Yeah. So she was sentenced to a further 100 days in prison. So she's currently in prison. So she would do things like send gifts to her targets. She would also, like I said, contact them pretending to be a friend of the original person. She created this whole world of aliases. So this case wasn't just about catfishing, obviously. This involved stalking behavior as well. So she did things like send screenshots of Google Maps showing herself outside the victims' homes or photographs of the victim's street through car windows, all sorts of things like that. And there was a lot of coercive control. This was a very, very complex case. There is a BBC documentary currently being made about this, a series of 3, because there's a lot involved.
Yeah.
She's one of the most prolific serial catfishers ever in the UK. So I'll be chatting on that about some of the research that we're going to talk about today. Because it's a really, really interesting case. It's obviously the most extreme end of the spectrum in terms of this. We will do an episode on cyber stalking as well, because there are similarities and overlaps, but there are differences. So cyber stalkers don't always hide their identity to form a relationship, or they are often somebody that you already know. It's often an ex-intimate partner or an intimate partner. But that key part of catfishing is hiding identity and creating a different identity. Okay. So catfishing can be part of stalking, and stalking can be part of catfishing, but they are 2 separate things. And there's so much research and they're so complex that they each deserve their own episode, I think. So in terms of legal issues in Ireland, inspired by both the GAA catfishing story and the case with Evine, the former Fianna Fáil Senator Lisa Chambers introduced a bill to tackle the problem. So she'd previously successfully introduced a stalking bill, which was great, but she's was trying to bring in a bill to make it a criminal offence to engage in catfishing. So that would allow the Gardaí or the police to act and provide an avenue for victims to get some restitution. And it proposed prison sentences of up to 5 years. But then the government ended in November and the bill fell by the wayside. So we're hoping that someone, the current Minister for Justice, will maybe bring that back up because it had gone quite far.
Totally contact your local TDs.
Absolutely. It'd be really good to see that. So at the moment, it's not illegal. So unless you commit fraud, unless you're trying to get money or goods from somebody, or you're engaging in enough persistent, unwanted communication with someone that it kind of meets the criteria of harassment.
Coco's Law, maybe.
Yeah, but with a catfish, you're probably in a relationship with them without realizing they're a catfish. So it's not unwanted behavior while it's happening. And that's the problem. So you can't retrospectively go back and say they weren't who I thought they were, so that behavior is now unwanted because it was wanted at the time. So it doesn't often qualify as harassment unless they start actually harassing you.
It's very nuanced. It has like borders on like really consent as well.
Yeah.
Like,
there's huge issues with consent. Yeah. Because if you're engaging in like online sexual behavior in some ways, sharing images, things like that, you are not sharing them with the person you thought you were, and so you are not consenting. You don't have the information you need in order to be able to consent. So also, if they share your intimate images without consent, then that is a crime. So there's a few different things that they could potentially do to make it a crime, but if you are just talking to them and developing a relationship with them, then that is not a crime. And then in the case of like Evie's case, the persistent communication wasn't with her, so it was indirect. It was using her identity with other people. So it feels like a form of indirect harassment, but that's also not a crime. And the person wasn't defrauding anybody or asking for goods. So it's
nuanced online behavior, but we need, like what I like about the non-consensual sharing of images act, so the Coco's Law that I mentioned, like I like that because it's really straightforward. It can actually tangibly be applied, and it is.
Yeah.
So you need catfishing legislation with language that is open enough that it is either crime against the person or on, but like targeting them or their identity, something like that, because this is quite nuanced. Yeah,
the new bill that's being proposed explicitly includes impersonating a person as one of the offences.
Okay, lovely, great.
I asked the question on Instagram. And we got some messages from the listeners. So I asked them if they had any experience either catfishing somebody, which of course nobody answered, wasn't really expecting anybody to, or being catfished. And we got two answers. And I think this shows that nuance in how people understand the term catfishing. Because the first one is that first thing I said. So some people Photoshop or touch up their photos to a drastic extent, and they look nothing like that in real life. And it is to an extent, but they are still putting themselves forward as themselves, just a very, very good version of themselves. They're not pretending to be an entirely different person, even though it might feel like it when you show up on the date. But the second one I think is interesting. So this is an attempt at it, not a very successful one. They said, I have a calorie count app, which has a community function where people can support each other. And surprise, surprise, I was contacted by an alleged surgeon doctor who was working in Gaza, and in brackets, and had time to contact a random woman who was just counting calories. The contact felt like online dating first messages. I did a reverse search on his picture, and the picture was of some doctor with online presence on social media. I just blocked the guy.
Such a weird place to try and do flirty dating. And it's like, because it's through like a health-based app, they're pretending to be a doctor. And then the persona just fails because they're a surgeon in Gaza, and you've just stolen a really obvious image.
Yeah. The setup is kind of like a romance scam, as in it's, a person situated abroad so they can't meet you, and they're in a prestigious job, a surgeon. And then they're in Gaza, which kind of gives them like some sort of backstory that's like quite heartrending, and you've got some empathy with them and all those kind of things. And the fact that they're doing it in something like a calorie count app means they don't need supporting characters. So it's not on social media as such. So I'm going to talk more about romance scams in another episode because I get to do all the dark ones. There's just too much.
There's heavy elements of like disinhibition in this.
Stop getting ahead of me.
Okay, sorry.
It's literally, that's my next point.
Okay.
So there's different kinds of catfishing. Like there's different motivations and reasons for doing it, which I will get into. But let's talk first about what it is about the online environment that makes it possible. So there's lots of similarity to trolling and harassment and the other online toxic behaviors that we talked about in those episodes. So the idea that online we are missing a lot of the nonverbal communication that we have in face-to-face situations. So you don't have all the bits of information, all those cues that you normally have, like facial expression, tone of voice, pitch of voice, body language, all of that. And that means that you aren't getting a lot of the information about the other person, and they have more control over what information they can give you. The fact that it's asynchronous, the communication isn't happening instantaneously, means that they have more time to edit and think about what they're sending. And they can create a better version of themselves or a better version of the character that they're sending to you.
There's also aspects of moral disengagement as well. We're able to disassociate from them too.
Yep. Absolutely.
You totally hate me for saying
getting ahead of me.
Okay.
But yes, there absolutely is. But we talked before about hyper-personal communication as well, I think in online dating and in trolling and harassment maybe. But hyper-personal communication is where you can have heightened feelings of intimacy and emotion online. And catfishers absolutely use that to their advantage. So people are more likely to self-disclose information about themselves, which they can then use to kind of leverage to develop a relationship with them, to get this feeling of intimacy so that they're sharing. They might share images. They might behave in a way that they might not offline. So all of this. So that online disinhibition is where you might do things online that you wouldn't offline. Your inhibitions are a bit lowered. And the anonymity online, the invisibility, you can't see other people, all of these things contribute to engaging in behavior that you might not offline.
But with all of these combined, and again, I know you gave out to me for it, but moral disengagement together, like we can justify the actions or our behavior. We can rationalize why we're doing it to you. We can minimize the supposed harms or risks that we're causing to you, and basically take away no guilt from that behavior.
What's really interesting about a couple of those cases, and particularly the Adele Rennie case, so you would think with online disinhibition, like the invisibility aspect of it means that you can't see the victim's reaction. And so you might be able to rationalize that they're not hurt. They're enjoying this conversation. They're enjoying this like relationship that they're having with you. She set up dates with people and then went to watch them get stood up on the date by herself.
There's no moral disengagement there.
So there's no moral disengagement. That is, and we will get into it in the personality traits part, but that is sadism, where you actually enjoy inflicting pain on other people, which is definitely a part of this.
There's a kind of like creepy voyeurism there as well. There
is, yeah. Now, not all catfishers do that. There's lots of different motivations for doing it, and I think why you're doing it influences what you do when you do it. But certainly these more extreme versions, there's something a lot darker there.
But like with the Adele Rennie case and was it Aveen? Where she was organising the dates in the coffee shop next door. Like they're very similar behaviours to each other. We can make an assumption that both the catfishes are in that space. One is where the victim is the person that's being impersonated. The other person is the person who's being catfished. So like they have different impacts. I think the case where she's impersonating that person on the date in her local coffee shop has this additional intrusive layer.
It's very...
But nothing was ever done about it.
No, because it's not legal.
Come on.
I know.
That must breach some form of stalking legislation. Okay, right.
Because they weren't contacting...
You can't see
the victim.
Nicola just shaking her head going, no, there's nothing.
No. They weren't contacting the victim themselves, so it doesn't appear to qualify.
It's like disassociated or one step removed stalking. And just... The coffee shop should like... There's no way for them to do anything about it either.
No.
Okay.
So let's talk about who these lovely people are. So what are their personality traits, other characteristics? What's interesting is that both the perpetrators and the targets of online deception have kind of different expectations about meeting in person. You know, the person who is the target of the catfish might want a relationship that ends up in person. The person who is the catfish obviously doesn't, because they are not that person and they're pretending to be somebody else. But despite that, these relationships can actually last for years because the person will provide valid reasons or excuses for why they can't meet in person. They will often get more and more dramatic as time goes on. But the relationship and the level of the relationship and how long it goes on for suggests that some sort of relational needs are being met for both of the people within that. So people are getting something out of it.
I have a question. I know I'm interrupting. I have a question. We've spoken about people who catfish other people. Is there any research about people who catfish themselves and talk about it? So there is, in cyberbullying research, we call it digital self-harm, where people will create a fake profile and victimize themselves. So, and there is research on that, and there's a lot of reasons, and it relates to like self-harm behavior offline.
Okay.
But is there anything, maybe this is something we can
not
have,
that I've come across, but there could be,
where people create a series of social connections like that? I'm going to keep talking about my people, top 16, where they create fake profiles that then interact with them to either create popularity or...
That is really interesting. I haven't seen any, but that doesn't mean it doesn't exist, because there's
absolutely
a lot.
Think this exists.
If it exists for cyberbullying, it would not surprise me to exist for this. But it makes me think about that podcast series from RTE about the real Carrie Jade, who was a catfisher in real life mostly, but also online. And I actually came across her on TikTok. I saw a video about her, and she was saying that she was a disabled woman who was renting out rooms on Airbnb in her house, and that people had come in and were super abusive to her because she was disabled. They were disgusted by her. They wouldn't share a fridge with her because it might be contagious, all this kind of stuff.
Right.
I remember seeing the first one thinking, God, that's terrible, quite over the top. Like, who would be like that? And then I saw another couple, and it like gained a lot of traction. It went quite viral on TikTok. And the second and third and fourth one that I saw, I was like, this is very over the top. This is quite weird. And it turns out she was kind of a renowned catfisher in Ireland and the UK. So she had made her way around Ireland over a number of years. And there's a whole documentary on all the different things she did. Really, really dodgy. She was involved in minding people's kids. She pretended to be many different kinds of people. Really interesting case. But that strikes me that she had like created an abusive situation for herself, but she didn't actually create the character who was abusing her. Okay, we need to do an episode on people engaging in digital self-harm like that and see if we can find some research on this for catfishing and cyberstalking.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay, interesting.
I would be very surprised if there isn't.
Yeah, that's fascinating. So both men and women engage in deceptive behavior, online and offline, generally for different kinds of reasons. So men are more likely to deceive others for self-serving purposes.
What's a self-serving purpose?
So they might, lie about their status, give themselves higher status, or their abilities or experiences. Whereas women generally try to encourage intimacy or make people feel better about themselves, and they're deceptive in doing that. So if you've ever seen any of those cases of fake illness online...
Oh, yeah.
There's so many examples. I could point people. I'm going to put so many podcasts in the show notes.
Okay. People don't have time.
Yeah, but like Belle Gibson in Australia was a fake cancer influencer. And what she was doing was getting intimacy from people, worry and concern and sympathy and so on from people, but also creating connection with other people.
It's like manipulative social support.
Yeah, exactly. So both genders are engaging in deception. Men have been found to be more deceptive than women. But of course, catfishing is more than just deception. There's a lot of manipulation involved in it, and there's intimacy involved in it. So personality seems to play a really significant part in that. But before I get to personality traits specifically, I want to talk about attachment theory.
Oh, I'm so boring. I love this.
I know. You love an L theory. So I'm going to describe the theory first so that you understand what I'm talking about. So attachment theory is like a theory going back to the 60s and 70s. Bowlby was the originator of it. And it was proposed as a way to understand how people develop emotional security and stability throughout the different stages of their development. So it looked at how kids interacted with caregivers and how that kind of contributes to how we engage in relationships over the course of our life. So when we become adults, we tend to focus more on our romantic partners as the object of attachment. So we look to get support from them and provide care to them. Now, in attachment, there are two dimensions that determine your attachment style. The first is how much you're comfortable with being close to people. So you might have a fear of dependence on people and distance yourself from them, or you might have a fear of abandonment in relationships.
So attachment theory is impacted by a bereavement of a parent, divorce, breakdowns in family structure. There's personality aspects to it, but there's a huge amount of research around Bowlby's theories. Like the strange situation experiment is based off Bowlby's work. There's so much literature in this space. That's
you can't just throw that in there without telling people what it is, though.
So you put a child in a room with its caregiver. Okay. So if they're insecurely attached to their parent, the parent leaves the room, who is this like anchor point to them, and they're worried about what's going to happen. Mum or dad is going to leave me. They disappear out of the room and the child has a complete meltdown. And they were originally playing with their toys and they were absolutely fine. And then the securely attached child, mum or dad leaves the room and they're like, no, you don't exist to me anymore and I'm cool with it.
Yeah, because they know you'll come back.
Because they have this security in this caregiver. But like all of this is impacted by the pre-existing relationships the child has. But there's loads of research that looks at this from a longitudinal perspective, about how people who are insecurely attached start to engage in things like crime, alcohol and drug abuse. I'm spoilering, sorry.
I know.
I can see by your face, you're
you
like,
can just read my mind. There is loads of evidence. And like in particular things like relationship issues like infidelity, divorce and intimate partner violence, which are quite relevant, I think, for something like this.
But it comes up in the cyberbullying research. I like this because my background is developmental psych as well. Okay, so that's why I'm like...
I should have just got you to explain.
No, but I think it's really good
be
because it's like, I think it's really interesting to see from an educators are trained on this right the way from SNAs to teachers, because attachment theory is really important. Like Montessori, all of our education programs involve some form of attachment theory basis. Yeah. Okay, that's me done. I'll stay quiet for a sec.
And I think it's really interesting looking at attachment theory in the case of cyberstalking perpetration.
Yeah.
They've also looked at it with victims as well. Victims tend to be securely attached because they're looking for a connection, but it's the perpetrators who appear not to be so securely attached. So attachment anxiety is where you're characterized by a fear of abandonment, excessive need for closeness. People like that, people with high attachment anxiety can kind of put themselves forward as being like helpless or needy or overly eager to get support and love and so on. They need a lot of reassurance. They also tend to disclose a lot of information about themselves and develop a strong connection quite quickly with a partner. Attachment avoidance, which is more fearful or dismissing, are the two characteristics of that. So that's more a fear of dependence and not like to being close to other people or dependent on them, particularly during times of distress. So people prioritize self-reliance and they tend to be more disengaged, particularly around emotional distress. So they might present as kind of lacking interest in a relationship. They also disclose less information about themselves. And that low self-disclosure may increase the potential for deceiving partners, right? What this research looked at was attachment theory in catfishing to see what characteristics they found in the perpetrators. And they found in this study, again, men are more likely to be the perpetrators, women are more likely to be the targets of catfishing. And quite a few studies have found that. Attachment avoidance was a predictor of catfishing status. So avoidance, though, wasn't the main thing. Anxiety was the most significant aspect of attachment theory in predicting catfishing status. Avoidance was only significant when both avoidance and anxiety were high. So where someone had a fearful attachment. Okay. So in other words, if you have that fearful style, then you might experience the fears of abandonment, but respond to emotional distress by withdrawing instead of seeking proximity with other people, and withdrawing by creating this deceptive character in order to create connection.
There's also like a protective element to it.
Yes, absolutely. So like this might kind of inform how clinicians and psychologists work with perpetrators and targets. So looking at it through that attachment lens, maybe it could be treated as like an attachment injury. So working to understand what the underlying emotional needs are behind that to help somebody deal with that and then not catfish again. But I think it's an interesting look at perhaps what's going on with some of the people who are engaging in this. So then moving on from that, let's talk about personality traits. You will have heard these traits before in our trolling and harassment episodes. These are the dark tetrad of traits, psychopathy, sadism, Machiavellianism, and narcissism. You will be hearing about them again because these are involved in so many toxic online behaviors. They characterize just so many things: cyberbullying, cyberstalking, catfishing, trolling, harassment, so many things. So you'll definitely be hearing about them again. So there are 4 subclinical personality traits. In other words, they are not like, it's not someone being a clinical psychopath. These are all personality traits. We are all somewhere on the spectrum of these personality traits. But if you're higher in these traits, you're associated with more antisocial and immoral behavior. All the traits share some similar characteristics like low agreeableness. So you're more irritable, less likely to get along with people, and high malevolence. Psychopathy is kind of a blatant disregard for social norms. So someone who's quite callous, has a lack of remorse. Sadism is enjoyment in causing pain to other people. Like that can be psychological or physical pain. Machiavellianism is more cunning and manipulative and exploitative. And narcissism is someone with a heightened sense of entitlement and egoism. In comparison to women, men tend to have higher levels of the dark tetrad traits in general, particularly psychopathy and sadism.
And does it vary for catfishing behavior?
That is where it gets interesting. These traits, except Machiavellianism, surprisingly, are present in people who are catfishers.
Machiavellianism isn't, so wanting to manipulate people.
Yeah, now it could be down to some characteristics of the study. The researchers were quite surprised to find that they didn't find Machiavellianism because it's manipulative, and catfishing is inherently quite manipulative. But they figured that there might be other things going on which prevented that happening. People who are higher in psychopathy are generally just more hostile towards other people. And that also makes them more likely to deceive other people as well. They tend to be deceptive in their relationships, in academic contexts, and they often deceive people to enhance their own self-presentation and to avoid punishment as well. They exploit relationships so that they can serve their own self-interests. And they really like tricking other people. So they purposefully manipulate and dominate other people. They're more likely to engage in deceptive online behaviors. So we talked about trolling and harassment, cyberstalking, bullying as well, online fraud. Like there's a lot of these different kinds of things. Mm-hmm. Whereas people who are higher in sadism enjoy hurting other people. And they, again, lie and deceive in academic and professional contexts. So there's a lot of deception involved in these dark traits. So they engage more, again, in online deceptive behaviors like trolling and deceiving and hurting their targets. They also tend to engage in deception in their relationships. So they are more likely to create fake profiles to cyberstalk intimate partners, which is catfishing and cyberstalking overlapping again here.
But there's a lot of consistency in the types of behaviors, the spaces where those are happening. So there's good reliability in some of these findings.
Yeah, exactly. Machiavellianism, which you might have expected to find, is about cheating other people to achieve your own goals. They didn't, like I said, find it in this study, but they have found it in other toxic behavior online. It tends to be found a little bit less often than psychopathy and sadism. The other reason why they thought they might not have found Machiavellianism is that people who are higher in that trait manipulate others in order to achieve very specific goals. And the catfishing questionnaire that they developed didn't actually talk about achieving specific goals. So it said things like, it had questions like, I orchestrate online scams, but it didn't say, I orchestrate online scams for financial gain. That's the specific goal. And so it may have been missing that goal-oriented aspect of it in the questionnaires.
I also wonder if you're high in Machiavellianism, you know about manipulating people. And therefore you're manipulating the researcher in your response with a socially desirable answer.
Entirely possible. Yes. Entirely possible.
I was just like, what's the other confounding variables in that study?
There's always so many when it comes to people because we're so bloody complex. But narcissism was found in this study, and that doesn't really surprise me because when you think about catfishing, it's about having complete control over the identities that you create and having a lot of control over other people. So like people who are higher in narcissism generally do engage in more deceptive online self-presentation. So they're trying to make themselves look better, get more attention, attract people. And they do it to improve their own status, to be more dominant over people, particularly if they're feeling inferior. So when we get into the motivations, you can see how this definitely plays a part.
It's like developing a sense of self online through your interactions, trying to improve your self-esteem through generally being a terrible person.
Yes.
That's my best summary I can achieve.
What's interesting as well is that narcissists are more likely to deceive themselves. The deception they involve to make themselves look better can evolve into self-deception, where they start to believe their own story, their own lies, basically. So they often have an inflated sense of their own ability, and they kind of deceive because they believe that deceit should be the truth. So all of those dark traits have been linked to deceptive and exploitive behavior, but we definitely have research linking all of them except Machiavellianism in this case to catfishing specifically. So quite a few studies have looked at gender and the dark traits and found that gender was a factor. So this particular study we've been talking about, gender was a factor, and men were generally more likely to be catfishes. But when the dark traits were introduced, they were much more important than gender. So what happened was, at all levels of the dark traits, men were a bit more likely to catfish. But at the higher levels, women were as likely or more likely to catfish than men. So it sort of evened out over the whole range of people. So women who are lower in those dark traits are less likely to catfish. Men are just are more likely to catfish across the whole spectrum. And everybody's more likely to catfish if you're higher in those traits.
But why at the lower levels is there a gender as a factor?
Because men are just more likely to lie than women in general, in life, offline and online.
Thanks.
Yep. Sorry.
I have no response.
So what is it about high psychopathy that might make people engage in catfishing, right? So it's an opportunity to exploit other people, to completely disregard any pain that you're causing them. It's anonymous, so it lets you get away with it. And like some of the characteristics of psychopathy are very impulsive, destructive, and unremorseful. So it kind of makes sense how that links into catfishing behaviors. And then I think for high sadism, it pretty much goes without saying, if you enjoy inflicting pain on others, then it kind of explains why you might enjoy hurting other people through creating a relationship that they cannot possibly fulfill.
But do catfishers also minimize their behavior or the resulting consequences of their behavior as well? So that like if you're lower in sadism, you could potentially might do those kind of rationalizations.
Yeah, possibly. But those who are higher in it, they enjoy ridiculing and embarrassing and harming other people.
The coffee shop example.
The coffee shop example. Both of the coffee shop examples.
High sadism.
Yeah.
I think that like I can't understand. I can't let go of the Machiavellian aspect, because I assume that for someone to be that calculated to organise dates in your coffee shop next door, absolutely sadism must be through the roof.
Yeah.
And psychopathy is probably through the roof as well. There's so much calculation in that behaviour that I can't see where Machiavellianism won't apply.
I know, yeah. So there's some earlier research from about 10 years ago that found men catfish generally more often than women because they tend to experience just less guilt about it, and they tend to deceive for more selfish and self-serving reasons. But the way that catfishing was defined in some of the earlier studies was that more general definition about like, you know, lying about your age or whether you have kids or things like that in a dating profile, rather than creating a completely different character. So I think it's interesting when you get into the more explicit catfishing criteria. I think that behavior is a little different to just general deception. So we know what kind of people they are. Delightful. But why are they doing this, right? Because there's plenty of people who are a bit higher in dark traits who aren't catfishing people. The most common form of catfishing is actually romance scams and things like sexploitation. I'm not going to talk about them here. I'm going to come back to those, but they are actually the most common. So financial reasons are the most common reasons for doing this. But then there's lots of other reasons as well. So Anderson and colleagues in 2019 did a really interesting study where they did a systematic review of all the research on deception in the online world. And it looked at different kinds of cyber deception as well as the perpetrators. So even though it's not specifically necessarily about catfishing in every study, they looked at a lot of different kinds of deceptions. They looked at things like Munchausen by internet, which is pretending to be ill online or pretending maybe that your child is ill online, theft and fraud, deception in virtual communities, and scams, and including romance scams. So even though it's not specifically catfishing, there's a huge amount of overlap with the catfishing research. And in particular with the research that's slightly less on solid ground. So there've been researchers who've looked at Catfish, the TV show, and analysed the motivations for people engaging in catfishing in that. Now, one of the reasons that's not, it's really interesting and I think it's really useful research, but because it's a TV show, the stories are curated, and even though it's a reality show, we know they are curated. They decide which stories they're going to focus on, they decide how they're editing them. You get certain parts of the story, you might not be getting other parts of it. And so you have to be very cautious in interpreting those stories as full and complete.
It's not a representative sample.
Exactly.
That's the term we would use.
But what is really interesting is that a lot of the themes that emerged from that research overlap a huge amount with this research on online deception. So I think it's really useful to look at. So they found 6 themes around why people are motivated to be deceptive online. Acquiring attention and sympathy, a response to negative childhood experiences, which kind of links back into what we were saying before.
Yeah.
And we'll talk about each of them in turn. Preserving identity and presenting your true self, to cause intentional harm and pursue personal enjoyment, to exploit people materially, and deception is a stress reliever in response to life strain. Okay. So I'm going to talk about each of those, but I just want to say that this kind of comes from incentive theory. So deciding to be deceptive, you try and balance the cost of doing it versus the reward that you might get from a successful outcome. In other words, if the reward is financial gain or satisfying your need for attention, it's possible that the online environment makes people feel like the cost of doing this might be lower because of anonymity and invisibility. Your fear of getting caught might be less.
I'm going to go back into developmental psych for just 2 seconds.
Okay.
So incentive theory, so you kind of touched on it. This is post-operational thought. So according to Piaget, so it's like in terms of developmental theory, you should achieve post-operational thought. So this is like, I know if I engage in X behavior, Y is going to be the outcome and Z is going to be the potential consequence. So post-operational thought, we should be able to do this. Pre-operational thoughts are like a younger adolescent. So if they engage in catfishing, we can say that they're not potentially able to fully see the outcome of their responses.
So they don't see consequences as well. Yeah.
And they get it to a point. So it's like, I can go to mum for X or I can go to dad for it, and I potentially will know the outcome of that response. Yeah. Whereas your prefrontal cortex is developed around about the age of 25. So I should at that point be able to go, I'm going to catfish someone. This is the behavior. This is the outcome of that. And these are the potential consequences that should happen as a result of it.
Should.
Okay.
Yeah. So the first theme, acquiring attention and sympathy. I think you see this around a lot of the people who fabricate an illness in order to receive care or sympathy or social attention from people. So sometimes, like from some of the cases that we've seen, it's a means of coping with a genuine psychiatric illness sometimes, but not always. The deception around things like that might be masking other issues or meeting psychological needs that aren't being met elsewhere.
This could be the digital self-harm or self-catfishing aspect, maybe.
Exactly. This is one of the strongest motivations in some of the studies for why people create a false persona online.
Okay.
So they're basically looking for connection and meeting their psychological needs. The second theme is the one in response to negative childhood experiences. So, for example, we talked in the social support episode about ACE events, so adverse
child experiences or childhood experiences,
in childhood, and they have long-term impacts. So some people might be trying to fill in the gaps in their relationships and interpersonal interactions and get emotional connection in a way that wasn't available to them then, and try to compensate through creating characters that they can connect with other people.
That's not going to be successful.
No. It's
Sorry,
not.
I don't know why I'm whispering. It's not going to be successful.
No. Well, it's not going to fully meet your needs because you're like, one of the ways that we form connections with other people is through authenticity. And if you're not being authentic, it's very hard to actually.
This is all role-played adverse childhood experience event or making up for it. So it's actually not a real.
Well, they could have experienced they could have experienced real adverse
ACE events. Yeah.
Yeah.
But I mean, if you're going to try and fill those gaps, you're creating them and you're curating them So you're not necessarily going to get the same developmental or like lifespan development improvement from them.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
The third theme was preserving identity and presenting your true self. So we talked about this in online dating. Some people just find it easier to be themselves online, particularly people who are socially anxious or shy. They can express their true self online, so that might be part of it. So the social norms online and also people's perceptions that everybody's lying online might allow permission for this kind of behavior. And so some people may express a true self that's very different from who they are presenting offline. So it could be for a number of different reasons, though. It could be self-promotion, it could be preserving their reputation. So they might actually want to communicate something deviant in their behavior or about themselves, but without any retribution. So they're doing it through a false persona, but it might be a part of who they are. And when you think about the dark traits, that might be part of it. Or they might be just trying to explore their true self.
But that really relates back to why potentially men engage in this behavior a lot more. In the research you spoke about men previously, all of these behaviors align to men more so than women.
Yeah, more reputational concern and preventing damage and so on. Yeah, and self-promotion, With this theme in the TV show Catfish, there were quite a few examples of this where particularly somebody could not be their full self in the offline world. So, for example, they were exploring a gender identity or a sexual orientation that they weren't allowed to express in the offline world.
Okay.
And so they were trying to be themselves and connect with somebody else in their authentic self, but they were deceiving the other person by doing that.
I've seen so many of those episodes.
Yeah, I haven't seen them.
I've seen so many.
But I think like it's a more understandable reason for doing it, but it doesn't change how that impacts on the victim on the other side of it.
Oh, it's completely like heartbreaking for that person. You've thought you're developing a romantic relationship with that person, and then they show up and they're the opposite gender that you are actually attracted to.
Exactly. And you've got those consent issues again.
Yeah.
Yeah, huge problem. The fourth theme is causing intentional harm and pursuing personal enjoyment. So here you've got your dark traits. Fully. So this is the darker side of deception where people are being malicious in their intent. So they might be intentionally trying to cause harm or control the situation for selfish reasons or enjoyment. So this is like trolling, very much like trolling. It's not linked to guilt or shame. It's people actually enjoying what they're doing. Manipulation is a key factor in creating a fake persona. And that's a skill rather than a personality trait as such. So manipulation is something you can learn, and that allows this motivation of harm to be successfully pursued.
I know I'm going to say it again, but Machiavellianism.
I know.
It's there. Like, I refuse to believe that it's not. It's also low levels of moral disengagement across that one as well.
Fully. Yeah. I mean, like, this is quite difficult to research because you have to find catfishers who are willing to admit it and answer questionnaires and so on. They are people who are not concerned with other people, who are quite hostile towards others. They're not altruistic. People who are altruistic are more likely to take experiments and surveys. So it's quite difficult to actually get people to do it and be honest, because they're also inherently more dishonest people.
Unless there's this like narcissistic sadism where they like they're similar to the research that was conducted around like serial killers and trying to get them to talk about their cases and their behaviors to actually understand them, some like a case study approach.
Yeah. So the fifth theme is exploiting people for financial goods or material goods. This is often not the initial reason for deception, unless it's romance fraud, in which case it absolutely is. But in a lot of cases, it's not the initial reason. But it may become a reason as the relationship with the victim evolves, and then they realize the connection they have allows them to leverage them for money or for other things as well. And then the sixth theme is deception as a stress reliever. This is where someone might be involved in like multiple high strain roles. So like being a caregiver, homeowner, having like a difficult career. They've got a lot of external stressors, and they engage in deception because it relieves their stress. So they might find an outlet for their negative emotions through an online persona. Creating that online reality can assist with that, and it's somewhere that they have complete control over the environment as well, which might really help with that as well. And then individual characteristics, perpetrator personality, we've already talked about. Lower levels of agreeableness, conscientiousness, and definitely the dark traits here. I think the one about the life strain is interesting because in the TV show Catfish, when people analyze the reasons for engaging in catfishing, some of those reasons were things like a substantial event, negative event that had happened in people's lives, like they'd had a significant bereavement, a job loss, etc. And creating this fictional world gave them control over that world. So that aligns quite well, I think, with that deception as stress reliever.
And Bowlby. Like, it's really interesting. It does. Like, all of these interact really well with each other.
Yes.
But like, if it's significant bereavement or life event, like, that's going to have a like significant impact in terms of like how you progress forward, your previous life experience. There's like so many different theoretical models you can look at to see how significant life events will impact future behavior.
Yeah.
But if you have a significant life event, a negative experience happens to you, the same with like cyberbullying or traditional face-to-face bullying, someone is victimized or has a negative experience, experiences a lack of self-control. And as a result of this, they seek to gain that control back.
Yeah.
And often that's by curating an experience like this.
Yeah, exactly. This is like when you get into the detail of how people actually engage in catfishing, you see a lot of variation. Like there's, again, not a lot of qualitative research on this where people have interviewed catfishers because it is quite difficult to do. Hopefully we'll see more and more of it over time. There was one by Simmons and Lee where they interviewed 3 people. So there was one where a woman thought her partner was cheating, so she made a fake account to test him and see if he'd fall for it. Is it catfishing? It is, I suppose, but it's very specific. She was only catfishing one specific person. Wouldn't be a strategy I would recommend, but you know. The second one was a man who created a female profile with pictures that he gathered on Google. He said that he wanted to see what type of responses he'd receive if he created an attractive female profile. He said he was bored, so that was why he did it. But he also found it boring after a while. He said, and it's quite funny to me after the online dating episode, a lot of the messages he got were sexual, and he thought that was kind of funny. So he stopped doing it after a while, and he said he wouldn't be bothered doing it again. And then one woman who catfished people for money, she was really desperate for money, so she took images online of very sexy young women and sent images to men for money over time.
That were of other people.
Okay. Yeah. So like there's just such a massive variation in who catfishes, why they're catfishing and so on. But those personality traits seem to be consistent across all the different types of catfishing.
So she created a fake account to test him. Mm-hmm. There's a Kate Bush song that basically is about this.
And if we play it, we'll get into trouble legally.
Yeah. Is it Babushka? Yeah, there's your homework. Okay. Also not to go in, but I couldn't help myself.
So what about victims? How are they feeling about all this? So there's some people who are, it really doesn't bother them all that much. So like the people who kind of messaged me on Instagram, they were like, well, this happens. They're not traumatized by it. Most people catch stuff quite early on. And it's sometimes due to the way people are interpreting catfishing. So it's just someone who's photoshopped themselves a bit too much and they don't quite look like they're supposed to. Like that's disappointing, it's irritating, it's time wasting, but you're not traumatized by it. But when someone who seriously catfishes you, has a completely different identity, develops a relationship with you, that can be a really big problem. And then the other side of it is the people who have their identity stolen, like Evine that we talked about earlier. People who are catfished, it can have really significant psychological impact. So when people become aware of it, victims report feeling depressed, anxious, paranoid. They often have increased feelings of embarrassment and anger and fear and shame. So it poses quite significant mental health risks. And it's really quite a negative and traumatic experience for people, particularly for more vulnerable populations. And it seems to really happen a lot in online dating. So this study looking at victims from Luckner in 2019 is looking at online dating specifically.
But I'm thinking these are very similar negative experiences that happen with other forms of online trauma.
Yes, trolling.
But my head goes straight away. You're talking about the negative, and my head goes, well, what are the protective factors? And this is the practitioner in me. Mm-hmm. So I'm like, increased resilience, sense of self-esteem, social support network, offline network that you can rely on, blocking, reporting, like all of those, like resilience, if you look at resilience in it within all of those cases, someone who has high resilience, and I mean very high resilience, can go into that coffee shop and be like, if that person comes up to me, I'm going to be able to tell them, no, that's not me. There's a person who's catfishing me, and unfortunately they have been catfishing you. Please block and report them. Whereas this person, if they have low resilience, this person is invading my coffee shop next door and my entire life. And that's going to have a significant impact.
Now, in that particular case with Evine, it was women that the catfish was targeting. So it was bisexual and lesbian women that the catfish was targeting. If that was men, even with high resilience, I don't know if I'd go to the coffee shop to tell men that someone else was catfishing them, because they may not believe you. They may feel that you're just rejecting them in a way that's indirect.
Yeah.
And men don't often like being rejected face to face.
Which is, I think that's fair
so
enough.
It's a safety issue.
Absolutely. But I mean, the resilience factor is important.
Oh, it is.
With all
it
of
is,
those.
absolutely, yeah. So we talked about the consent aspect of it. So you're engaging in a relationship, potentially a sexual relationship, because a lot of catfishing is about romantic relationships. And when the person isn't who you think, you are not able to give consent because you do not have the information you need. Obviously, when it's romance scams or there's fraud involved or they're trying to get money out of you, then there's financial loss that goes with that.
And it's a clear crime.
Yeah, exactly. At least in that case, it is a crime. It's very, very common. So a number of studies have found that in or around half of the people studied have had an attempted catfishing attack on them. Now, that could be like the one on the calorie counting app where you immediately go, yeah, that's not real. But it just means it's very, very prevalent. It's very common. And again, bear in mind those differences in definitions. So that could be someone showing up on a date to someone who doesn't look exactly like they thought they were and thinking it's catfishing as well.
There could be overlaps between catfishing and phishing as well.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. And romance scams.
Yeah.
The kind of red flags to look out for are things like not video chatting, right? So they may have a really good reason why they can't meet you in person. They're in a different country or whatever. They'll often, if they're supposed to be local to you, there's often illnesses, accidents, car crashes, hospital visits, things like relatives dying that mean that they can't come and meet you. If that's happening more than once, then that is a huge red flag. They'll lie about their demographics. They might, if anyone asks you for money and you haven't physically met them in person, that is a significant red flag as well.
I'm laughing, but I'm like, if someone was to ask me for money that I had never met before, I'd be like, no.
Well, that's the thing. So we haven't talked about romance scams yet, but that's one, like if your partner asked you for money, you would, if you had it, you would give it, right? Because you'd want to support them. With romance scams and with some of these catfishing scams, you have been groomed over a long period of time, potentially a year or so. You feel like this person is your partner. And so when they ask you for money, that doesn't feel like a violation of social norms. It doesn't feel like giving money to someone you've never met. It's someone you're in love with, in a relationship with.
I think I'm primed, though.
Yes,
like,
well, we're
not normal.
Yeah, we study this and we teach it, so we should
never
pick up on
send
it.
money to someone who you don't know, but also be cautious about sending money to people you do know.
Yeah, just don't give people money.
There's a really old, it's not a proverb. I don't think it's as sensible as a proverb. It's lender nor borrower be.
Okay. Yes.
Yeah.
Didn't you just buy a house?
I'm such an old lady.
Some of the risk factors for catfishing, and I'm sure there's more as well, this is just from one study, but using multiple dating apps, having multiple relationships at the same time in the past 5 years, adding strangers as online friends, all of those are increased risk factors for catfishing. It just means you're online in slightly riskier situations. And that means you've just got to be a bit more cautious about who you're connecting with and who you're talking with.
Basically all form of internet and technologies.
So that is the end of our catfishing episode. We will be back talking about romance scams, cyber stalking, and other lovely, delightful topics again. But if you've been affected by any of this, or if you need help with any of this, or you know anyone who does, please check our show notes and we will have resources for mental health resources, but also resources for contacting the Gardaí in Ireland. And if you are outside of Ireland, please, if you've got experience with something like this, do contact your own police force. The laws may be better where you are than they are here. Thank you so much for listening. You can find us in 2 weeks' time for our next episode. You can follow us on social media at InBits Podcast on Blue Sky, YouTube, Instagram,
and
TikTok.
I always forget about that one. Our episodes have been edited by Owen Hurley, who's also provided our production and lovely music for our show. Thank you for listening, and we'll see you in 2 weeks.
See you then.